The morning sun had not yet fully crested the horizon when Daniel Carter's voice, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the quiet of the farmhouse kitchen. "Lazy woman won't bring money into this house, then you'll work until your body gives up." Emily flinched, a reflex honed by repetition. She stood near the door, already dressed in worn clothes that carried the permanent scent of soil and yesterday's sweat, her cracked red hands clenched at her sides. To respond was to invite more venom. Silence was her only shield. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, clean and comfortable with a mug of coffee, watching her with the dispassionate scrutiny one might give a faulty piece of equipment. "Well," he said, the single word dripping with contempt. "The sun's already up. You planning to waste the day, too?" Emily offered a mute nod and reached for the old straw hat that had belonged to her father, a faint relic of a gentler past. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers brushing the frayed brim, then placed it on her head, lowered her eyes, and stepped out into the waiting heat. The air outside was already thick and oppressive, promising another day of merciless sun. The field stretched before her, a vast, dry expanse of unturned earth that felt less like inheritance and more like a life sentence. This land had been her father's pride, his lifelong companion. He used to say the land remembered who treated it with respect, a sentiment that now felt like a cruel joke. To Emily, it was a prison, its boundaries the walls of her cell. Behind her, Daniel's final command followed her out. "And don't come back until the rows are done. I'm not feeding someone who doesn't earn it." She kept walking, the weight of his words a physical pressure between her shoulder blades. By midday, the sun was a blinding white disk in a bleached sky, and sweat had plastered her thin blouse to her back. A sharp, aching hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she did not pause. Stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant accusations, meant withheld food, meant the cold fury that filled the house each evening. With every lift and strike of the hoe, Daniel's litany played in her mind: lazy, useless, burden. She remembered a different man from the early days of their marriage, one who smiled easily, who spoke of building a future together, of making the land prosper. That Daniel seemed like a character from a story she'd once read, a faint and fading illusion. When she finally dragged herself back to the house hours later, legs trembling and throat parched, the world inside was a different planet. The warm, savory smell of cooked food hung in the air, making her empty stomach cramp violently. Daniel sat at the table with his mother, Margaret. He was relaxed, laughing softly at something on his phone, while Margaret ate with precise, slow bites, her back rod straight. Neither looked up as Emily entered. She stood awkwardly just inside the doorway, the dirt from the field still clinging to her boots. "Is there anything left?" Her voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret lifted her eyes, their expression cold and assessing. "Did you finish the field?" "I finished the rows you marked," Emily replied, forcing the words out. Margaret sniffed dismissively. "That doesn't mean you worked hard." Daniel smirked, not looking up from his phone. "Mom's right. You always cut corners." Emily felt a familiar despair rise in her chest. "I just need something small. I haven't eaten since yesterday." Margaret placed her fork down with deliberate care. "You'll eat when you start contributing like a real wife." "I am working," Emily insisted, a faint spark of defiance flickering. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Working isn't the same as earning. You don't bring money, you don't help this family, you take." Emily's eyes flicked to Daniel, a silent plea for some shred of intervention, some memory of kindness. He studiously avoided her gaze, suddenly engrossed in his meal. "There's water outside," Margaret added flatly. "That should be enough for tonight." Emily nodded, the motion automatic. She always nodded. Turning, she walked to the small, sparse room that served as her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and hunger. On the rickety nightstand sat an empty bottle of prescription medicine. She had asked Margaret that morning if she could get it refilled. The migraines were becoming unbearable. Margaret had laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You don't need medicine, you need discipline. Now, lying back on the thin mattress, she stared at the water-stained ceiling, and her father's voice, firm and clear, echoed in her memory. Don't ever sign the land away, Emily. Promise me. She had promised, and then, overwhelmed by grief after his death and charmed by Daniel's confident plans, she had let him handle things. It seemed easier then. He had sounded so sure. The next morning dawned with the same brutal rhythm. Daniel's greeting was a command, not a salutation. The back section needs clearing today. Emily merely nodded, her head pounding. That afternoon, a minor surprise. Margaret sent her into town to buy bread, pressing a few crumpled bills in her hand with a warning. Don't take long. The walk felt alien, a fleeting taste of a world beyond the fence line. People passed her on the sidewalk, their eyes sliding over her sunburned, work-worn figure without recognition. She caught her reflection in a store window, a gaunt, weathered woman with tired eyes, a stranger wearing her own face. She purchased the bread and stepped back into the mild afternoon sun. And then she saw them. Across the street, standing too close outside the feed store, was Daniel. His hand rested possessively on the lower back of Rachel Miller, a woman from a neighboring farm. Rachel leaned into his touch, her head tilted toward his shoulder as they shared a laugh. It was an intimate, comfortable scene. Emily's heart seemed to stop, then plummet into her gut. She moved instinctively, ducking behind a parked truck, peering through the windows. She watched as Daniel reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Rachel's cheek. She watched as Rachel smiled up at him, a slow, knowing smile. Then he kissed her. It wasn't a quick, furtive peck. It was soft, lingering, familiar. Emily waited for some sign of shame, for Daniel to glance around guiltily. He didn't. He pulled back only to murmur something that made Rachel laugh again, then slipped his arm around her waist as they walked away, easy and entwined. Emily stood frozen long after they had disappeared. The loaf of bread slipped from her numb fingers and hit the pavement. Mechanically, she bent to pick it up, brushed off the dust, and walked home, each step feeling hollow, as if she were a ghost moving through a solid world. The house felt suffocating that evening, the walls pressing in. Daniel was already at the table, pretending normalcy. "You took your time," he remarked idly. Emily placed the bread on the counter, her movements deliberate. Her hands were steady, a stark contrast to the tempest raging inside. "I saw you," she said, her voice low but clear. Daniel raised an eyebrow, a picture of mild confusion. "Saw me where?" "In town, with Rachel." Margaret looked up sharply from her knitting. "What are you talking about now?" Emily kept her eyes locked on Daniel. "You kissed her." For a fleeting moment, a crack appeared in his facade, a flicker of alarm, quickly smothered. Then he laughed, a dismissive, scornful sound. "You're imagining things." "I'm not," Emily said, her voice gaining a brittle strength. "I saw you." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "You're tired. You don't eat. You work yourself into these ideas." Rachel's name hung in the air between them, toxic and undeniable. Margaret shook her head, clicking her tongue. "I knew this would happen. Idleness makes the mind weak." Emily turned to her mother-in-law, a bitter incredulity breaking through. "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're ungrateful," Margaret replied coolly, and looking for excuses. Daniel stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I've had enough of this. If you're going to accuse me, you'll work harder to make up for it." Emily stared at him, the betrayal curdling into a cold, hard lump in her chest. "You're punishing me for telling the truth." "I'm correcting you," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tomorrow, you'll finish the front field and start the east side. Alone." The east side was a vast, weedy tract, impossible for one person in a day. "That's too much," she whispered. Daniel took a step closer, his presence threatening. "Then stop lying." He turned his back on her, the discussion evidently closed. That night, sleep was impossible. Emily lay in the dark, the image of Daniel and Rachel burning behind her eyelids. Her father's voice returned not as a memory, but as a clarion call. "Don't let anyone take what's yours." She had let them take her peace, her health, her dignity. But there was one thing they hadn't taken yet. Before the first hint of dawn tinged the sky, she was up and dressed. Outside, the world was still and blue. She lifted the hoe, its handle smooth from her grip, and brought it down. Each strike into the cool earth felt different now, not an act of submission, but of grim resolution. With every step, a single, clarifying thought solidified. This land was not Daniel's. It never had been. The following days settled into a new, more sinister pattern. Emily's body began to fail her in small, telling ways. Dizziness that made the world swim, a constant throbbing in her head, hands that shook even at rest. One morning, Daniel and Margaret presented her with a stack of papers at the breakfast table. "Household documents," Margaret explained briskly, tapping the top page. "Simple permissions. It'll make managing expenses easier." Her vision blurred as she tried to focus on the text, catching phrases like property oversight and temporary authority. A cold dread seeped into her veins. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly. Daniel sighed, the picture of exasperated patience. "It means you trust your family to handle things you clearly can't." "I want to read them," Emily stated, finding a sliver of steel in her voice. Margaret's lips pressed into a bloodless line. "You don't need to understand every word to be a good wife." Daniel leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you being difficult again?" The accusation hung in the air. "I just want to know what I'm signing." "You're paranoid," Daniel snapped, straightening up. "Ever since you started imagining things about Rachel." "I didn't imagine it." "There you go again," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You work all day in the sun and then accuse me of nonsense. You should be grateful I put up with it." Margaret slid the papers and a pen closer. "Sign." Emily stared at the pen as if it were a serpent. Her father's voice whispered, "Don't rush when it comes to land. Never rush." "I'll sign later," she said, pushing the papers back. Daniel laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Of course you will." She fled to the field before they could press further, her heart hammering against her ribs. The physical labor became a torture, but her mind was now relentlessly awake. One afternoon, she heard the sound of an unfamiliar truck. Peering from the field, she saw a well-dressed man in sunglasses talking to Daniel by the porch. Their voices, though low, carried on the still air. "I told you I'd get it," Daniel said, his voice strained. "Just need more time." The man crossed his arms. "Time costs money, Daniel." Daniel replied, the words desperate. "I'll sell. Soon." An icy clarity washed over Emily. "Sell." The man glanced toward the field. "What about the wife?" Daniel scoffed, not even bothering to lower his voice. "She doesn't matter." The truck departed, and Daniel caught Emily watching. His glare was pure venom. Get back to work. That night, lying awake, she heard Daniel on the phone in the hall, his voice a tense whisper. "I just need the land sold. Yes, I know it's in her name. I'll handle it." Emily pressed her ear to her door, her breath catching. Her name. The land was still legally hers. It was the one thread he couldn't snap, the one lock he couldn't pick without her. The next morning, under the pretext of needing supplies, she walked into town and found her way to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the counter looked bored until Emily gave her father's name. "That estate, it's still active," the clerk said after a moment of clicking through her computer. "What does that mean?" Emily asked, her mouth dry. "It means nothing was ever formally transferred. The land is still legally part of your father's estate. You're listed as the sole beneficiary." Emily thanked her and stumbled back into the sunlight, the world tilting on its axis. Daniel's entire edifice was built on a lie. On her way back, Rachel intercepted her near the market, a smile playing on her lips. "You look tired," she cooed with false sympathy. "Still digging all day?" Emily said nothing. Rachel stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Daniel worries about you, you know. Says you get confused." Emily met her gaze directly. "Why are you doing this?" Rachel's expression hardened slightly. "Be careful, Emily. People already think you're unstable." She leaned in so close Emily could smell her perfume. "Sign the papers. It'll be easier that way." Back in the field, armed with this new, terrifying knowledge, Emily worked with a frantic energy. The sun was a brutal enemy, her body a traitorous vessel of pain and weakness. But her mind was a fortress. Daniel wanted to sell her land. Rachel knew, Margaret knew, they were a unified front waiting for her to break, to sign, to disappear. The hoe rose and fell in a punishing rhythm. Then, on a strike that should have met the usual resistance of packed earth, there was a different sound, a sharp, hollow clang that vibrated up the wooden handle and into her bones. Metal. She froze, glancing around wildly. The field was empty, the house silent. Dropping to her knees, she brushed away the dry soil with frantic fingers. Beneath the surface was something smooth, solid, and unmistakably manufactured. A corner, then an edge, a metal box buried deep, its dark surface treated to resist rust. Her father's face swam before her eyes, his quiet certainty, his refusal to sell, no matter the offer. "What did you do, Dad?" she whispered to the uncaring earth. Working carefully, she cleared the dirt from the lid, revealing a small but sturdy lock. Using a stone, she pried at it until, with a reluctant click, it gave way. Lifting the lid was like opening a tomb and a treasure chest at once. Inside, protected by sealed plastic, were thick folders of documents, stacks of papers, and a smaller metal case. Her hands trembled as she lifted out the top folder. Numbers swam before her eyes, account statements, bank names, legal trusts, and one figure, repeated again and again, that made her breath stop. $100 million. She shuffled through more papers, bearer bonds, offshore holdings, asset listings. It was impossible. Her father, who had driven an old truck and mended his own clothes, had been sitting on a fortune. At the bottom of the box, she found an envelope with her name written in his familiar, sloping hand. Tearing it open, she began to read. "My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then I was right to wait. I didn't make my money the way people around here do. I stayed quiet, I stayed small, and I watched. I learned early that greed listens even when you whisper. I buried this because land hides things better than people. I hid it because I knew one day someone would come into your life who saw you as a path, not a person. This money is yours, but only if you remember who you are. If you endure betrayal without becoming cruel, if you choose patience over rage, power over revenge. I trust you, Emily, even when no one else does." She folded the letter, pressed it to her heart, and wept silent, shuddering tears into the dirt. The irony was not lost on her. Daniel, with his insults and cruelty, had been driving her to unearth her own salvation. With frantic care, she reburied the box, smoothing the earth to hide any disturbance. As she stood, wiping her face, a soft crunch of gravel made her blood run cold. A flashlight beam cut through the twilight, pinning her in its glare. "What are you doing out here?" Daniel's voice was suspicious. "I couldn't sleep," she stammered. "Funny," he said, stepping closer, the light sweeping over the recently disturbed ground. He knelt, running his hands over the soil, then digging in with his fingers. "Get away from that," Emily cried out, a surge of protective fury giving her voice strength. Daniel looked up, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "There it is," he breathed. He grabbed her arm, his grip brutal. "You found something." He dragged her, stumbling, back to the house. Inside, under the harsh electric light, Margaret and a smugly concerned Rachel awaited. A scene was orchestrated, accusations of instability, of digging up nonsense, of paranoia. When Daniel shoved her into the small storage room and locked the door, Emily slid down the wall, her cheeks stinging from where he'd struck her. Through the thin wood, she heard their plans unfold. She was digging. She must have found something. Then we dig tomorrow properly. And her? She stays put. She's safer this way. Later, Daniel came to her alone. "You're going to tell me what you found." "I didn't find anything." He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "You don't learn." He leaned in, his breath hot against her face. "That box, whatever it is, it's mine. It's my father's. Your father is dead," Daniel stated flatly, and the finality in his words extinguished any last ember of hope for the man she'd married. The next morning, he marched her to the field at shovel point. She led him to a spot near, but not exactly on, the true location. Greed made him careless. He dug like a madman, and when his shovel finally struck metal, he let out a guttural cry of victory. He dragged the heavy box back to the house, where Rachel and Margaret watched with rapt, avaricious attention. He hacked at the lock until it yielded, and paper spilled across the floor. The sight of the numbers, the official seals, the sheer scale of it rendered them momentarily speechless. 100 million, Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse with awe. "My father was careful," Emily said calmly from the doorway. Daniel laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "You think this changes anything?" Emily reached into her father's letter and began to read it aloud. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the room, each word a judgment. When she finished, a profound silence fell. Daniel lunged for the documents. "This is mine." Emily didn't move. Touch them again, and the triggers activate. To their confused stares, she explained, her father's foresight her armor. "The box is registered. If it's opened without the proper codes and authority, alerts go out. Lawyers, banks, the authorities." Daniel froze, disbelief and dawning horror warring on his face. "You're lying," Rachel hissed, but her confidence was cracking. "Check your phone," Emily said softly. Almost in unison, 3 phones buzzed on the table. Daniel looked at his screen, his face draining of color. The distant wail of sirens, growing steadily louder, sealed the moment. Panic erupted. Rachel was the first to bolt, grabbing her purse and fleeing without a back glance. Margaret simply sagged in her chair. Daniel backed away, sputtering denials that no one heard. The knock at the door was firm. Emily answered it to find 2 police officers and a severe-looking woman who introduced herself as Sarah Whitman, her father's attorney. The following hours were a blur of official statements, verified documents, and the satisfying click of handcuffs around Daniel's wrists. He was led away shouting about unfairness, his voice growing fainter. Margaret was taken in for questioning shortly after. The subsequent legal proceedings were methodical and thorough. Daniel's gambling debts, his forgeries, his systematic coercion and abuse were laid bare. Lucas Reed, the neighbor, testified shamefully about being pressured to report Emily's conversations. Margaret's complicity in withholding food and medicine was documented. Rachel had vanished from the county entirely. Emily sat through it all, a quiet, composed figure. She did not gloat, she did not rage. She simply presented the truth, allowing the weight of the evidence to speak for itself. The judge, in his final ruling, returned everything to her: the land, the assets, the house. She sold the house soon after, but she kept the land. It was, and would always be, her anchor. Months later, at sunrise, Emily stood at the edge of the same field. The soil was the same color, the air held the same morning chill, yet everything was different. She knelt and pressed her palm into the earth, feeling its cool, life-giving solidity. "Thank you," she whispered. to her father, to the land, to her own enduring spirit. She did not build a mansion or flaunt her wealth. She invested wisely, restored the neglected acres, paid workers fair wages, and funded a small local clinic. Her father's letter sat in a simple frame by her bed, a daily reminder. She learned, through the hardest of lessons, that wealth gained through cruelty is a fragile, fleeting thing, while integrity, once forged in fire, is unbreakable. The ground that had been meant to bury her had in the end become the very foundation upon which she rose. Emily's new life unfolded with a quiet, deliberate grace that stood in stark contrast to the frantic, angry noise of her past. The first thing she did, after the legal dust had settled and the deeds were irrevocably in her name, was to walk the entire perimeter of her father's land. She did not do this as a surveyor assessing assets, but as a pilgrim returning to a sacred site. She walked slowly, her boots sinking into the soft loam of the recently plowed fields, her fingers brushing the rough bark of the old oak that marked the western boundary, its branches spreading like a protective canopy. She stood for a long time at the spot where the metal box had been buried, now just an unremarkable patch of earth among many. She felt no urge to dig it up again. Its power was no longer locked in metal, but transferred into the quiet certainty that now resided within her. The land was no longer a prison or a burden. It was a testament, a living archive of her father's silent wisdom and her own survival. She moved into a small, clean rental cottage on the outskirts of town while she decided what to do with the farmhouse. It held too many ghosts, too many echoes of harsh words and hollow silences. The decision to sell it came easily. She wanted no physical remnant of Daniel's reign. The sale was quick. The proceeds added to the careful financial structures her father's attorney, Sarah Whitman, helped her manage. Sarah became more than a lawyer. She was a steady, pragmatic guide in a world Emily was only just beginning to navigate on her own terms. There was no lavish spending, no sudden transformation into a society figure. Emily's needs were simple, and her father's letter was a constant moral compass. Choose patience over rage, power over revenge. Her power would not be wielded like a weapon, but like a tool for repair. Her first act of repair was for the land itself. She hired a small, reputable crew, led by an older farmer named Joe, who had known her father and had always tipped his hat to her with a sympathetic glance, even during the worst times. Under his guidance, they began a program of careful restoration. They rotated crops to replenish the soil, planted clover as a cover to prevent erosion, and repaired the old irrigation ditches that Daniel had left to clog. Emily worked alongside them, not as a boss, but as a student. She learned about soil pH and crop rotation, about the importance of letting certain fields lie fallow. Her hands, still calloused and strong, now worked toward creation rather than mere endurance. The physical labor was the same, but the spirit behind it had transformed. She felt her father's approving presence in the smell of turned earth and the sight of green shoots breaking through the dark soil. The community watched her, of course. Small towns have long memories and sharp eyes. The scandal of Daniel's arrest and the whispers of sudden, mysterious wealth had made Emily a figure of intense, if guarded, curiosity. Some looked at her with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with outright envy. She ignored the sidelong glances in the grocery store and the sudden dips in conversation when she entered the post office. She simply went about her business with a polite, unassuming demeanor. She paid her bills promptly, supported the local feed store, and donated a significant but anonymous sum to the struggling town library for a children's literacy program. Slowly, through consistent action, the narrative began to shift. The story was no longer about the poor, abused wife or the lucky heiress, but about the quiet woman who was bringing her family's land back to life. She did not seek out confrontation with those who had wronged her, but she did not hide from them either. One afternoon, several months after the trial, she encountered Margaret Carter in the aisle of the hardware store. Margaret looked older, diminished, her once stiff posture now slightly stooped. She was examining a row of paint samples, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, Emily considered turning another aisle, but her father's words about endurance echoed, and she walked forward. "Margaret," she said, her voice neutral. Margaret flinched, then turned, her eyes wary, braced for scorn. "Emily." The word was an acknowledgement, heavy with unspoken history. There was a long pause. Emily looked at the paint sample in Margaret's hand, a soft, pale yellow. "That's a cheerful color," Emily remarked. The mundane observation hung in the air, a fragile bridge over a chasm of pain. Margaret's eyes flickered with surprise, then a complex shame. "The apartment, it's very plain," she muttered, referring to the small place she'd moved into after her conditional release. Emily simply nodded. "Light helps." She didn't offer help, didn't offer forgiveness. She merely offered a sliver of human recognition, which, in its own way, was a more powerful statement than any accusation. She moved on, leaving Margaret standing there, clutching the paint card, a single tear tracing a line through her powder. Of Daniel, she heard only fragments. He had pled to lesser charges in a deal, avoiding a longer trial, and was serving a minimum security facility. His debts had consumed what little he had left. There were no visitors, no repentant letters. Emily found she felt nothing for him, not hatred, not pity. He was simply a closed chapter, a lesson learned in human avarice. His cruelty had been a blunt instrument, and it had shattered at the bedrock of her father's foresight and her own resilience. She hoped, in a distant way, that he found some kind of peace, but she knew his peace was no longer her concern. Her energy was reserved for the living, for the future. That future took a more defined shape the day she visited the county's social services office. She went under the guidance of Sarah Whitman, who was helping her establish a private charitable foundation. Emily wanted to understand the local needs firsthand. She sat in a cramped meeting room with a weary but kind-eyed director named Linda, who spoke frankly about the gaps in the system. Families choosing between medicine and heat, women trapped in dangerous situations with no resources to flee, farm workers injured on the job with no safety net. Linda spoke of a recent case, a young mother who had fled an abusive husband with her 2 children, now living in a condemned motel on the highway because the women's shelter was full. "We give her what we can," Linda said, rubbing her temples. "Food vouchers, a list of lawyers, but it's a stopgap. She needs safety, stability, and time to breathe." Emily listened, her own past rising like a ghost in the room. The empty stomach, the locked door, the calculated isolation. She saw not just the young mother, but herself. On the drive back to the cottage, an idea, clear and compelling, began to form. It wasn't enough to give money anonymously. She needed to build something. She spent the next week in deep consultation with Sarah and Linda, and then with an architect. Her vision was specific. She would not build a traditional institutional shelter. She would use a portion of the land, a peaceful, wooded 5-acre plot near a creek, separate from the main farm, to create a small residential community. It would be called Haven Fields. There would be a main, home-like building with private apartments for families, a communal kitchen and garden, a childcare space, and quiet rooms for counseling and legal meetings. Around it would be smaller cottages, places where women could live for up to 2 years, rent-free, while they received counseling, job training, and help rebuilding their lives. The connection to the land would be central. Residents who wished could work in the organic garden or with the animals Emily planned to introduce, not as labor, but as therapy, a way to reconnect with their own strength, to nurture and see growth. When the plans were finalized and the permits secure, Emily called a small, quiet press conference. She stood before a simple rendering of Haven Fields, her voice soft but firm. She spoke not of her own suffering, but of the need she had seen. She announced the establishment of the foundation, funded by her father's legacy, with the mission of supporting survivors of domestic abuse and economic coercion in rural communities. She quoted, without attribution, the core tenet from her father's letter: to endure betrayal without becoming cruel, to choose patience over rage, power over revenge. The power, she explained, was in creating a space where healing could begin. The story made a small ripple in regional news, but in her own county, it was seismic. The narrative solidified. Emily Carter was not just a survivor, she was a builder. The construction of Haven Fields became a community project in ways she hadn't anticipated. Joe's crew volunteered their skills on weekends, local businesses donated materials, women from the town church group started a quilting bee to make blankets for the future cottages. Even the skeptical townsfolk found it hard to argue with tangible good. Emily was at the site every day, wearing jeans and work boots, discussing plumbing lines and garden plots. The physical act of building, of watching beams rise and walls take shape, felt like an exorcism and a consecration. She was literally building her future from the ground up, on the very land that had witnessed her deepest despair. It was during this time of focused creation that she reconnected with a part of herself she had thought lost, the part that could experience simple, uncomplicated joy. It happened on a Saturday when a group of volunteers had gathered to plant the first trees around the perimeter of Haven Fields. Among them was Ben, the local veterinarian, a man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a calm, competent manner. He had donated his time to consult on the plans for the small animal barn Emily wanted to include, believing in the therapeutic value of caring for creatures. They found themselves sharing a lunch break on a stack of lumber, their conversation easy, moving from soil drainage to the personalities of his clinic's resident cats. He asked her opinion on the best type of fencing for goats. He listened to her answer, really listened, his gaze thoughtful. There was no pity in his eyes, no calculation, just a quiet interest in the woman she was now. It was the most ordinary of interactions, and to Emily, it felt extraordinary. It was a reminder that not all attention was a prelude to a demand, that not all conversation was a battlefield. Haven Fields opened its doors on a bright spring morning, 18 months after Emily had first read her father's letter. The first resident was the young mother Linda had spoken of, her children clutching donated teddy bears as they explored their new sunny apartment. Emily did not make a grand speech. She simply handed the woman a key and said, "Welcome home. Take your time." The woman's tears, this time, were of relief, not despair. As Emily walked back to her own cottage on the main farm, she felt a profound sense of completion. The circle had closed. The suffering inflicted upon her had been metabolized, transformed into a sanctuary for others. The cruelty had been answered not with more cruelty, but with a profound and active compassion. Years flowed by with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. Haven Fields thrived, a quiet engine of hope that saw women and children arrive frightened and broken, and leave, if not wholly mended, then strengthened, armed with resources and a renewed sense of their own worth. Emily remained its heart and its chief benefactor, but she also cultivated her own life. The main farm became a prosperous, sustainable model, its produce sold at a premium at local farmers markets. She built a simple, beautiful home for herself on a rise overlooking the fields, with wide windows that framed the sunset. Ben, the veterinarian, became a constant in her life, a partner who appreciated her strength and soothed the residual shadows with his steady, unwavering presence. They married in a small ceremony under the old oak tree, with Joe and Linda and a few of the long-term Haven Fields staff as witnesses. One autumn evening, many years later, Emily sat on her porch with a steaming mug of tea. The sky was a riot of orange and purple, and the harvested fields lay in neat, stubbled rows, resting. In her lap was a photo album. She turned the pages, pictures of Haven Fields' first garden yield, of smiling residents at graduation ceremonies from job training programs, of her and Ben laughing on a hiking trail. Near the end of the album was a single weathered page in a plastic sleeve. her father's letter. She didn't need to read it, she knew it by heart, but she touched the plastic over his handwriting. Her life was full, rich with purpose and love, yet the past was never truly buried. It was compost, enriching the soil of the present. She thought of Daniel, released now, rumored to be living far away. She thought of Margaret, who had passed the previous winter, alone but for a hospice nurse paid for by an anonymous donor. She thought of the countless small betrayals and the one enormous salvation. The lesson was carved into her bones. True power lies not in domination, but in preservation, of legacy, of dignity, of hope. The ground that had once threatened to become her grave was now a foundation that supported not just her, but an entire community of the wounded and healing. She had unearthed a fortune, but in doing so, she had discovered something far more valuable, an unshakable self, forged in silence and hardened in fire, now dedicated to casting light. The lazy woman who wouldn't bring money into the house had in the end brought something infinitely more precious, a future. And as the last light of day faded, Emily Carter smiled, a quiet, enduring smile, and went inside to the warmth of her home. The years following the opening of Haven Fields settled into a rhythm that felt less like a new chapter and more like the discovery of a truer, deeper version of the song Emily's life was always meant to sing. The sharp edges of memory softened, not from forgetting, but from being surrounded by so much present-tense living. The main farm, under her thoughtful stewardship and Joe's experienced guidance, became a local exemplar of sustainable agriculture. They experimented with heirloom varieties, established a small but profitable apiary for pollination and honey, and set aside a portion of the land as a wildflower meadow to support the beleaguered bee populations. The success was measured not just in revenue, which was robust and carefully managed by Sarah Whitman's firm, but in the health of the soil, dark, rich, and teeming with life where it had once been tired and depleted. Emily took immense, quiet pride in this. It felt like a direct dialogue with her father, a way of honoring his deepest love. The land was no longer a secret vault or a field of punishment. It was a partner, a giver of life, a legacy in active, fruitful bloom. Her marriage to Ben was the quiet harbor she had never dared imagine. He was a man of few but meaningful words, whose kindness was expressed in action, fixing a loose step on her porch before she mentioned it, reading veterinary journals by the fire while she pored over foundation reports, his calm presence a steady counterweight to the occasional storms of memory that still, sometimes, gathered on her horizon. He understood her need for space, her moments of introspection that could last an entire walk around the property. He never pressed, only waited, and was always there when she returned, a cup of tea ready or a hand extended. With him, she learned the vocabulary of a love that was neither demanding nor desperate, but simply present. They adopted 2 rescue dogs, a grizzled, 3-legged border collie named Scout, and a timid spaniel mix called Maisie, whose joyful, uncomplicated devotion was its own form of therapy. Their home was filled with books, the smell of bread baking, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who were utterly at ease with one another. Haven Fields, meanwhile, grew into its name. It was not a flawless utopia. There were struggles, setbacks, tears of frustration as well as joy, but it worked. The model of longer-term, holistic support proved transformative. Women arrived hollow-eyed and fearfully quiet. They were given time to sleep through the night without jumping at shadows, time to sit in the garden and feel the sun without someone demanding something, time to remember who they were before the world tried to erase them. The communal garden became a powerful metaphor and a practical tool. There is something inherently hopeful about planting a seed and tending it to fruition. Children who had learned to be silent began to laugh again in the dedicated play space. Emily was not a daily manager. Linda had come on as full-time director, her weary eyes now alight with purpose, but she was a constant presence. She would come to read to the children, to help can vegetables from the garden, or simply to sit and listen if a resident wanted to talk. She never offered platitudes or easy answers. Her authority came from a place of shared understanding, unspoken but deeply felt. She was living proof that the other side of hell was not just survival, but a life rebuilt with intention and grace. The foundation bearing her father's name, the James Holden Foundation, expanded its reach beyond Havenfields. It funded legal aid clinics specializing in protective orders and custody battles for rural women. It offered microloans to survivors starting their own small businesses, a bakery, a cleaning service, a dog grooming van. Each loan was more than money. It was a vote of confidence, a statement that their dreams were valid and achievable. Emily reviewed every application with Sarah, not as a distant benefactor, but as a careful steward. Her father's warning about greed, listening even when you whisper, made her vigilant about the foundation's integrity. It was run with transparency and a sharp eye on sustainable impact, not publicity. Her own past, of course, was a matter of public record, but she rarely spoke of it publicly. She found her voice not in recounting the trauma, but in articulating the vision that grew from it. When she did give the occasional interview or speak at a fundraiser, she focused on the systemic gaps, the need for safe housing, the economic traps that kept women vulnerable. She spoke of her father's legacy as one of quiet protection, and of the land as a place of healing. The local newspaper, which had once gossiped about the Carter mystery, now ran features on Havenfield's success stories and the farm's organic methods. Emily had successfully rewritten the narrative, not through force, but through steadfast, generative action. Then, one crisp October afternoon, a letter arrived. It was not an email or a formal document from Sarah's office, but a handwritten letter on plain stationery, postmarked from a city several hundred miles away. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular and tight. She opened it at the kitchen table, a faint sense of foreboding in her chest. It was from Daniel. "Emily," it began, without salutation or pleasantry. "I suppose you never expected to hear from me. I'm not sure why I'm writing. They make us do a lot of thinking in here, programs about accountability and making amends. It feels like a script most of the time. But I've been thinking about the land. I used to look at it and only see dollar signs, a way out of a hole I kept digging. You looked at it and saw something else. I never understood what. I thought you were weak for loving dirt. I was wrong. I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm not asking for anything. I know I forfeited any right to even say your name. But I wanted to say, for whatever it's worth from a man like me, that I see what you built there. I read an article in a waiting room. Haven Fields. I guess my cruelty was the fertilizer for something that actually grows. The irony is not lost on me. I'm not a good man, Emily. I don't think I can become one. But I am, for the first time, a sorry one. Daniel. Emily read it twice, then folded it neatly, her hands perfectly steady. She felt no seismic shift, no upwelling of old anger or pity. Instead, she felt a profound, almost clinical sadness for the wasted years, for the man who could only recognize beauty and strength in the aftermath, for the love that had curdled into something so toxic. His apology was not a key to any lock. She had already opened all the doors herself. It was simply a datum, a piece of information confirming a truth she already knew. She did not keep the letter. She took it outside to the fire pit where they burned fallen branches, struck a match, and watched the paper curl and blacken, the words turning to smoke that dissipated into the autumn air. It was not an act of vengeance, but of hygiene. Some ashes were not meant to be kept. She told Ben about it that night, not because she needed counsel, but because they shared their lives. He listened, his arm around her shoulders as they looked out at the starlit fields. "What did you feel?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She thought for a moment. Like an archaeologist finding a piece of broken pottery from a forgotten civilization. It tells you something about how they lived, but it doesn't change the landscape you're standing in. He nodded, understanding her metaphor perfectly, and kissed her temple. The past was acknowledged, then allowed to recede. As more years passed, Emily and Ben's life together deepened in its comforts and expanded in its joys. They traveled occasionally, but always found themselves eager to return to the familiar contours of their land. They took in a foster teenager for a year, a sharp, angry girl named Chloe who had cycled through half a dozen homes. The farm, the animals, the relentless, patient routine of chores, and Emily's unflappable, no-nonsense kindness worked a slow magic. Chloe didn't become a storybook miracle. She remained a complicated, wounded young woman. But she graduated high school, and with the Foundation's support, went to community college to study agricultural science. Her parting gift to Emily was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the property's soil composition, her own fierce way of saying thank you. It was framed and hung in the farm's office, a testament to the fact that healing sometimes wore a leather jacket and combat boots. When Emily turned 60, Sarah Whitman retired. At the small party in Sarah's honor, the lawyer, her own hair now silver, pulled Emily aside. "Your father would be so proud," she said, her usually professional demeanor softened by emotion. "Not of the money. He never cared about that. He'd be proud of the steward you became. He was always afraid his silence would be a burden. Instead, it became a foundation." Emily squeezed her hand, words unnecessary. The circle of her father's trust was complete. The final act of her public story, though she did not see it as final, began with a call from the State Historical Society. Their research had uncovered the largely unknown philanthropic work of James Holden and now wished to honor his daughter, the principal force behind the foundation that bore his name, with an award for contributions to the state's social fabric. Emily was reluctant. The spotlight still felt dangerous. A potential distortion of the quiet, grounded work she loved. But Linda and Ben convinced her. "It's not for you," Ben said gently. "It's for every woman at Haven Fields who needs to see that survival can lead to recognition. It's for the idea." So she went. She wore a simple dark blue dress, her hair in its usual practical style, now streaked with gray. She sat in an ornate hall as speeches were made about economic impact and charitable giving. When her name was called, she walked to the podium, the weight of many eyes upon her. She looked out at the audience, not seeing dignitaries, but seeing instead the faces of the women from Haven Fields, the determined set of Joe's shoulders as he plowed a field, Ben's calm smile, her father's patient eyes in an old photograph. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear in the microphone. "This honor belongs less to me and more to a legacy of quiet faith. My father believed that the truest wealth was what you planted, not what you possessed. For many years, I misunderstood that. I thought the planting was a literal back-breaking task, and it can be." A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "But I've learned it is more than that. It is planting safety for a terrified mother. It is planting opportunity for someone who is told they had none. It is planting the idea in a child's mind that kindness is a strength. The ground we are given in life, whether it is soil, circumstance, or heritage, can either bury us or become the medium for unimaginable growth. I was lucky. I was given both a piece of land and a father's love that taught me, eventually, how to tell the difference. My work, and the work of the James Holden Foundation, is simply to be good gardeners, to prepare the soil, to provide the shelter, and to trust in the resilient, miraculous will to grow that exists in every human spirit. Thank you." There was a moment of silence, then sustained applause. It was not the flashy, dramatic speech some expected, but it was profoundly authentic. It resonated because it was true. Afterward, as people mingled, a young journalist approached her. "Miss Carter," she asked, "what would you say is the most important lesson from your journey?" Emily considered, then said, "That the world will try to define you by what you lack, by your loneliness, your poverty, your silence. Your power lies in redefining yourself by what you choose to cultivate. Cultivate your mind. Cultivate your compassion. Cultivate a small patch of ground, literally or figuratively. What you grow will always, in the end, be stronger than what tried to bury you." The drive home with Ben was quiet, the ceremony's glitter fading into the comfort of the familiar highway. "You were wonderful," Ben said, reaching over to take her hand. "You always are." She leaned her head back against the seat, tired but content. The award was put on a shelf in the Foundation's office, a nod to the outside world. It didn't change anything. The next morning, she was up at dawn, pulling on her old boots to walk the fields with Scout and Maisie. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and coming frost. She stopped at her father's oak, its leaves a blaze of gold and crimson. She placed her hand on the trunk, the bark rough and real under her palm. She thought of the lazy woman, the worthless wife, the burden. Those ghosts had no power here. They had been dissolved by 10,000 mornings like this one, by the tangible proof of harvests gathered and lives mended, by the love of a good man and the purpose of sacred work. She had brought money into the house, more than Daniel could have ever dreamed of, but that was the least of it. She had brought back a legacy from the brink of oblivion. She had brought hope to a patch of land and to countless lives. She had brought herself, whole and powerful, into the light. The story that began with a sentence of condemnation had been rewritten word by careful word, deed by steadfast deed, into a sentence of grace, a long, complex, beautiful sentence that was still being written with every sunrise over the thriving, generous fields she called home. The work was never truly over. There were always new rows to tend, new seeds to plant. But now she worked not until her bones gave up, but because her spirit was inexhaustible, fed by the very ground that had once threatened to claim her. And in that endless, cyclical giving and receiving, Emily Carter had found her forever. The award sat on the shelf in the James Holden Foundation office, a polished piece of crystal and brass that caught the afternoon sun. But Emily's world continued to turn on the axis of simpler, more vital things: the health of the soil, the quiet progress of a resident at Haven Fields, the warmth of Ben's hand in hers as they walked the dogs at twilight. The outside recognition had been a ripple that soon smoothed back into the pond of her daily life, leaving only a slight, pleasant shift in how the wider community viewed her work, not as a curious anomaly, but as an established, respected pillar. This legitimacy made certain practical things easier: funding partnerships, navigating zoning for a planned expansion of Haven Fields Childcare Center, convincing skeptical local officials about new programs. Emily used this newfound leverage not for prestige, but as a tool to dig deeper, to anchor her work more securely in the bedrock of the community. Seasons cycled with their reliable rhythm. The farm entered a phase of gentle, mature productivity. Joe, though he'd officially retired, still came by most days, his role shifting from foreman to revered elder statesman, holding court on a bench outside the equipment shed, dispensing wisdom to the younger farmhands Emily had hired. She made sure he had a share in the profits, a comfortable pension drawn from the farm's revenue. It was a quiet repayment for the kindness he'd shown when a simple question, "Are you okay?" had been a lifeline. The land, under its careful rotation, seemed to grow more fertile with each passing year, as if rewarding the respect it was finally shown. Emily started a small farm school program where children from the local elementary school could spend a day learning where food came from, not from supermarket shelves, but from seeded earth and patient tending. She loved watching their small, earnest faces as they pulled carrots from the dirt or collected warm eggs from the hens. It felt like planting a different kind of seed, one of connection and understanding for the next generation. At Haven Fields, the work evolved. With stability and a proven model, Linda and her team began to focus more on the what next, the transition from sanctuary to full, independent reintegration. They developed a partnership with the community college for guaranteed internships, and a local business consortium pledged to interview graduates of the foundation's job training programs. The success stories were Emily's real trophies. The woman who opened her own hair salon employing 2 other Haven Fields graduates, the mother who earned her nursing degree and came back to volunteer at the on-site health clinic, the quiet, artistic teenager who found her voice through a foundation-sponsored pottery class and now sold her wares at the farmer's market. Each story was a stone in the causeway Emily was building across the chasm of despair she herself had once stared into. Her relationship with Ben deepened into a companionship that was the bedrock of her happiness. They were partners in the truest sense. He took over the management of the small animal therapy program at Haven Fields, his calm, professional manner a perfect fit for both the creatures and the residents who cared for them. At home, their life was a tapestry of shared routines and quiet understanding. He was there when the ghost of a migraine, a relic of her past deprivations, would send her to a darkened room, bringing her cool cloths and silence. She was there when the loss of a beloved animal patient at his clinic weighed heavy on him, listening as he talked through the difficult day. They built a greenhouse together, a project of glass and hope where they grew citrus trees and orchids, a splash of perpetual summer against the gray winters. It was a love that did not shout, but endured. It did not consume, but nourished. Then, one spring, a different kind of letter arrived. It was from a publishing house, following up on a query from a writer named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, the letter explained, was working on a book about transformative rural philanthropy, focusing on individuals who used inherited resources to effect deep systemic change in their communities. She had come across the story of the James Holden Foundation and Haven Fields and was profoundly moved. She respectfully requested the opportunity to interview Emily to understand not just the what, but the why of her life's work. Emily's first instinct was a firm, polite refusal. The idea of her life being dissected and packaged for public consumption felt invasive, a violation of the hard-won privacy she cherished. She discussed it with Ben and with Sarah Whitman, who still served as the foundation's board chair. Sarah, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity. She said, "Think of it not as an exposé on Emily Carter, but as a case study on the Holden model. This could be a blueprint for others. It could attract serious impact investors, replicate the program in other counties. Your story, the parts you choose to share, could be a tool." Ben, sensing her trepidation, simply said, "You control the narrative, Em. You always have." After much reflection, Emily agreed to a single preliminary conversation with Eleanor Vance with the strict condition that it take place at the farm on her terms. Eleanor arrived on a mild May morning. She was a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a manner that was neither fawning nor aggressive, but respectfully observant. They sat on the porch overlooking the wildflower meadow, cups of peppermint tea between them. Eleanor did not press with personal questions about Daniel or the abuse. Instead, she asked about the land. She asked about James Holden, what kind of man he was, what phrases he used, what he loved about the specific curve of this hill or that creek. She asked about the moment the idea for Haven Fields shifted from a thought to a conviction. Emily, disarmed by this approach, found herself speaking more freely than she anticipated. She talked about her father's quiet stewardship, about the sound of the hoe hitting metal, about the terrifying and liberating weight of the letter. She spoke of the philosophy of the foundation, not charity as a handout, but empowerment as a collaborative process. "It's about restoring agency," Emily found herself saying. "When everything has been taken from you, your choices, your voice, your sense of safety, the first step back isn't money. It's the power to decide something, even something small. What to plant in your garden plot, what color to paint your room, whether to get a GED or learn coding. We provide the safe ground for those decisions to be made without fear. The resources we give are just the tools. The rebuilding is their own." The interview lasted 2 hours. As Eleanor packed her bag, she thanked Emily, her gratitude seeming genuine. "You've built something remarkable here. It's not just a shelter or a farm, it's an ecosystem of dignity." Emily simply nodded. She had done her part. The book, she decided, was out of her hands. Months later, a manuscript arrived for her review. With a knot of anxiety in her stomach, she read it. Eleanor had been true to her word. The book, titled Fruitful Ground, Cultivating Hope from Legacy, was indeed a case study. Emily's personal history was handled with a dignified brushstroke simplicity, enough to provide context and profound motivation, but never salacious detail. The focus was overwhelmingly on the model. The integration of sustainable agriculture with social services, the economic philosophy of the foundation, the testimonies of residents and staff, the hard data on outcomes. Emily was portrayed not as a tragic heroine or a saint, but as a thoughtful, determined implementer of a visionary legacy. It was accurate. It was respectful. She gave her approval. When the book was published the following year, it created a significant stir in niche academic and philanthropic circles. The Holden model became a term of art. Emily found herself invited to speak at conferences, not about her pain, but about asset-based community development and trauma-informed program design. She accepted a few selective engagements, always with Ben by her side. She was a compelling speaker precisely because she lacked theatricality. Her authority came from the quiet certainty of lived experience and proven results. The Foundation's endowment swelled with donations from inspired readers and institutions. Sarah's prediction had been correct. The story, carefully framed, had become a powerful tool for scaling the work. This new phase of influence brought Emily a different kind of fulfillment. She began to mentor a handful of other individuals, mostly women, who had come into unexpected resources through inheritance, sale of family land, or other means, and wanted to use them purposefully but were unsure how. She advised a Harris in the next state on establishing a network of transitional housing, and a young man who had sold a tech startup on funding mental health services in Appalachian communities. Her guidance was always practical. Start by listening to the community, not by imposing a solution. Invest in leadership already on the ground. Be patient. True growth is never fast. She became a quiet node in a growing network of purposeful wealth, a translator between privilege and need. Through all this, the core of her life remained unchanged. She still rose early, she still walked the land, she still knew every employee and resident at Haven Fields by name. The glittering world of conferences and philanthropy was a costume she put on occasionally. Her true self was in her boots and worn jeans, her hands in the soil, or resting on the shoulder of a woman taking a brave new step. One winter evening, many years after the publication of Eleanor's book, Emily and Ben were cozied by the fireplace. A fierce snowstorm swirled outside, but inside was warm and bright. Scout and Maisie, both gray-muzzled and dozing on the hearthrug, were long gone, replaced by a lazy hound named Rufus. Emily was reviewing architectural plans for a new community kitchen at Haven Fields. Ben was reading a veterinarian journal. The silence between them was warm and alive. "Ben," she said, looking up from the blueprints. "Hmm?" he replied, glancing over. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the land, the unseen presence of Haven Fields down the road. All of this, from there to here. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I think it's the least strange thing in the world. You took what was given to you, a good man's love, a piece of the earth, a strong heart, and you built something true with it. That seems like the most natural progression there is." Tears, rare and sudden, pricked Emily's eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a profound, almost overwhelming gratitude for the simplicity of his understanding. He saw her not as a survivor or a philanthropist, but as a builder, a gardener, a woman who loved her land and her people. That was the identity she had chosen, the one she had cultivated with such care. The storm raged on, but inside, all was calm. The story of the lazy woman was a distant echo, a folk tale from another lifetime. The real story, the ongoing story, was of a woman who had learned to listen to the wisdom in the soil and the strength in her own spirit, who had turned a sentence of condemnation into a lifetime of gentle, unwavering affirmation. She had worked not until her bones gave up, but until her heart was full. And she knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots of her father's oak, that the work, the good, hard, joyful work of cultivation, would go on, in her hands and in the hands of those she had inspired, for generations to come. The final word was not an ending, but a seed, carried on the wind, waiting for fertile ground.